here. Thought it was a good spot with lunch. You can eat. Hear from our great speakers. Our first one up is Natalie Mims Frick. She's with the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. And then we'll also have Karma Sawyer, who is with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So both have some very interesting discussions and data to share with us about demand flexibility and flexible load management. So would ask you all to go ahead and continue to keep eating. If you can, keep your conversations quieter as we go forward with here. And I believe first up is Natalie. Natalie, are you there?
I am. Good afternoon.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. I will hand it off to you.
I have one question. I was wondering if I could share my slides because I changed them around a little bit in the last, I don't know, 18 hours. If not, it's not a big deal. I can work with this, but I didn't know if that was an option.
Unfortunately, it is not an
All
option.
right, we're gonna go with this.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
No worries.
If you would like, and I'll make this announcement to everybody, Natalie, if you want to get us those new slides, we can put those new slides in the deck that we share with the attendees after the event. Will that work?
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Okay. And for everyone else, there were a couple of design issues on the slides when that transferred from the speaker to us. Those will be fixed, and those presentations will be provided to you after the event. So fantastic. Natalie?
Yeah, all right, let's get going, and we can go on to the next slide. So I'm talking about demand flexibility today, which is often also called load flexibility. And it's the ability of demand side loads to change the consumption patterns, often to meet when electricity generation is happening. And it's important because the electricity system is changing. And I'll talk about that more, I think, on my next slide. But this one is about how it's important for distributed energy resources to provide grid services at the right time and in the right location. And that's kind of a big premise of demand flexibility is your resources have to be showing up when your grid needs are occurring. And they also have to be if it's a distribution system constraint that you're trying to solve in the right place. I guess that's also true of transmission. So we can go on to the next slide. And so this is what I was initially speaking to, but demand flexibility is important because the grid's changing, and it's important that we have resources that are flexible and can reduce peak demand or provide flexibility to the grid, and also help achieve policy goals such as integrating growing shares of renewable energy or other decarbonization goals, or just trying to keep a low-cost system. And this slide shows an example of demand flexibility where there's a battery charging to meet charging and discharging to meet solar generation, and then the decline in generation that's from CAISO from this year. We can go on to the next slide. So states are interested in demand flexibility for a variety of reasons. Most of the presentation that I have today is going to feature some research that Berkeley Lab did recently, and we identified objectives and key indicators for state actions, and it was legislative, regulations, executive orders, and programs that advance demand flexibility in buildings. And so we organized the objectives that we found for why states are interested in demand flexibility into 4 different categories, which are environmental, reliability and resilience, affordability, and other consumer benefits. We can go on to the next slide. Another reason that I'm sure you are all familiar with that states might be interested in demand flexibility is to address extreme weather. Demand flexibility can help grid operators as they go through these challenging extreme weather events in the summer and the winter to maintain reliability and keep costs low. We can go on to the next slide. So this is from the report that I referenced earlier, and the link is in the bottom left corner of the slides. We know why demand flexibility is important, but how can states and utilities promote it? And there's lots of options for states and utilities to advance efficiency and demand flexibility. And there's 10 of them, 10 little graphics that are shown on this slide. I'm going to talk about examples from codes and standards, resource standards, utility planning, state energy planning, and related regulations. So those are the ones that I'll touch on. And then I'll close out my presentation with a handful of examples from utility programs that promote demand flexibility. We can go on to the next slide. So this first example is from New Jersey, and the Board of Public Utilities was required to create a new state energy plan. And as part of that, the Board of Public Utilities included demand flexibility strategies in the plan that was released, and those included piloting alternative rate design to manage EV charging and encourage customer-controlled demand flexibility. And there's a couple other ones listed on here. The Board of Public Utilities also has to establish integrated distributed plan requirements that allow for anticipated growth of DERs and EVs. And a couple other examples, there's Massachusetts, I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. They have a state efficiency plan that allows active demand reduction. And then in North Carolina, they have a clean energy plan. And there's a recommendation that load flexibility be better utilized to meet clean energy goals in that. So really all over the country. We can go on to the next slide. The next couple of slides are about codes and standards. So this is a little bit California centric, but states can use building codes to advance demand flexibility as well. And the energy code can value efficiency or demand response based on the timing of when the savings occur. And in Title 24, California has time-dependent valuation as a compliance metric. And that just measures the maximum energy consumption that a proposed building can be designed to consume. And so it compares the proposed design to the actual, to what the energy budget is under the building energy code. And it's one of the compliance paths that states can, or that builders can use. And the codes also have some demand response ready requirements, in particular in the non-residential code. And there's additional demand flexibility aspects included in Title 24, including occupant controlled smart thermostats and heat pump water heaters. There's a report that PNNL published not too long ago that talks about how to incorporate demand flexibility into building energy codes. That's a resource that I have linked over there. And then moving forward, the 2025 update to Title 24, the Building Energy Code in California, one of the goals that they've stated is to promote demand flexibility. So I think we'll be seeing more of kind of this demand response, demand flexibility ready type requirements as part of the compliance paths. And there's also, California is in the process of developing a flexible demand appliance standard. And the only appliance that they're working on right now is for pool pumps. And that will require them to be connected ready devices or connected devices beginning in 2024. And that's an active rulemaking. We can go on to the next slide. Similarly, Oregon and Washington are both requiring that new electric storage water heaters include a grid communications port. And this essentially is, a USB port that allows for communication with the water heater so that the load can be flexed, even if it's a type of communication that allows devices that weren't necessarily designed to communicate to participate in demand response programs. And so this is a recent requirement in both Washington and Oregon that can enable demand flexibility. We can go on to the next slide. My next examples, this one is about actions that regulators can take. And this is on providing a financial incentive for achieving or exceeding peak demand reduction targets. And the first example I have here is from Illinois, where in September of last year, the commission approved a peak load reduction incentive, and this is for Ameren. And it goes both ways. So if the utility doesn't achieve their designated goal, they have a reduction in basis points from the utility's return on equity. And then if they overperform, they have an increase in their basis points for their return on equity. So it's not all that common that you see an incentive that cuts both ways, but that's an example of one, and promoting flexibility. Another example is from Washington. The Utilities and Transportation Commission, or the UTC, approved a demand response performance incentive for Puget Sound Energy on their current portfolio. And it encourages them to obtain demand response resources through programs like direct load control or pricing programs. And they receive a different percentage incentive based on their performance. And that's what's shown in that table on the right. It's capped at $1 million over the 2-year planning period, or the 2-year performance period. It ranges from their weighted average cost of capital percentage as an incentive up to 15%. So we can go on to the next slide. Another tool that's available for states are energy efficiency resource standards, and specifically including demand reduction requirements in them. And the examples I have here are from Colorado and Maine are examples of states that do this. And the example that the graph that I have on the right side of the slide is from Efficiency Maine, and it shows their summer peak electric load reduction from their energy efficiency programs. So significant reductions from their retail initiatives. And then Hawaii is in the process of updating, or they were in the process of updating their energy efficiency portfolio standard, and they spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to incorporate demand flexibility and demand response into the target moving forward. We can go on to the next slide. So from a planning perspective, one option is that IRPs can consider demand flexibility measures and the time-sensitive value of efficiency. And the examples I have here, so for a long time, Oregon has required modeling efficiency and demand response on par with other resources. More recently in South Carolina, the legislation required the utilities to include efficiency and demand response in IRPs, and to provide opportunities for customers to reduce or manage their electricity consumption to reduce peak demand and other drivers of utility cost. And then Hawaii requires demand side resources to be treated on a consistent and comparable basis with supply side resources, in part by developing supply curves for energy efficiency and modeling them as supply side options in their capacity expansion modeling as part of their integrated grid plan. We can go on to the next slide. So another option is to allow demand response to comply or to be a compliance resource as part of your energy efficiency resource standard. So in addition to making it a goal, you can also just let it participate. And so in Nevada, they have a multiplier for energy efficiency that's saved during peak periods. It's not an example of demand response, but it is, trying to align reductions when the grid needs them most, and providing an incentive for that. Massachusetts has their Clean Peak Energy Standard, and demand flexibility is an eligible resource for that. The compliance can include reduction in loads to meet a portion of the peak load, and it focuses on periods of highest electricity demand. And then Michigan has an energy waste reduction standard that is focused on efficiency and also allows load shifting and renewable energy to meet up to 10% of the standard. So we can go on to the next one. And this is an example of, a commission can develop design principles to guide actions around demand flexibility. And this is from a couple months ago. The California Public Utility Commission, the CPUC, adopted demand flexibility design principles to guide in the development of demand flexibility tariffs, systems, processes, and customer experiences. And they cover, rate design, third-party aggregation, dynamic pricing, and also enabling customers to have greater control over their electricity bills. So it's pretty broad, also compensation. So very broad design principles that are going to be applied across proceedings. We can go on to the next slide. Another option in utility planning is to include demand flexibility and also bring in equity strategies in it as well. And this is from this one example at the top is from Washington. And in this example, there's very broad legislation that requires the utility to include to include equity across a variety of planning proceedings, including their clean energy improvement plans, which are really focused on reducing emissions and integration of renewable energy. And so they have to provide, the utilities in their plans have to provide analysis of whether the forecasted distribution of benefits and reductions of burdens accrued or are reasonably expected to accrue to highly impacted communities, vulnerable populations, and all other customers. And they also have to describe how the utility intends to reduce risks to highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations associated with the transition to clean energy. So, demand flexibility is a resource to get to your clean energy goals and thinking about how to bring equity into that as well. And there's this text box that I have on the slide talks about some examples of bringing equity into planning more broadly than just demand flexibility and more broadly than just planning as well. So, Massachusetts, Colorado, Oregon, Maine, the regulators are required to consider equity issues and meeting state goals and rates and decision making. So very broad. We can go on to the next slide. So my next group of slides is what I'll wrap up with, and they're examples of utility programs that have implemented demand flexibility. So this first one is an example of how a utility identified efficiency measures that reduce consumption when costs and emissions are high, which allowed them to prioritize deployment of resources when the grid needs them most. So you can kind of hopefully see the legend along the bottom. Blue bars are cost savings, orange and gray bars are carbon savings, and then yellow bars are site BTU. And this is from Excel Energy, and they conducted a study to determine what resources, what energy efficiency programs were going to save the most energy when marginal avoided costs and emission values were high in 2018, and then also looking forward to 2028. And so they did an 8760 annual hourly analysis, and they considered the impact of 20 different strategies on a commercial design assistance program. And so there's 4 of those strategies that are shown here. And there were some interesting results where they had a strategy that was cost effective and produced carbon savings today and in the future, which is the lighting power density. It's the third group of bars over, so they're all positive regardless of the year. They looked at strategies that reduced that will become cost effective and produce carbon savings in the future, but not necessarily right now, which is that heat pump and variable refrigerant flow heating. So, the cost effectiveness is there today, but the carbon savings aren't there today, but they'll be there in the future. And then other examples of where the carbon savings there's not carbon savings associated with the program, and the cost savings don't become available until the future, or carbon savings are not available, but the strategy is cost effective. And so this was one way for Excel to think about how to focus the efficiency measures that they had in their commercial design assistance program. We can go on to the next slide. So this is an example from Massachusetts, and it's looking at demand reduction goals that are included in efficiency, and also allowing demand response to contribute to achieving those goals, and thinking about how to include flexibility in your efficiency portfolio. And so this has the 2022 portfolio for the state, the performance of it for non-active and active summer and winter capacity savings. And demand response is active savings. And so what we have shown are the big blue bar on the top is from C&I existing buildings. That's producing the largest amount of capacity reductions. There's no winter capacity reductions that are occurring, but there is efficiency and demand response savings that are reducing capacity in the summer. So This is how they're thinking about their portfolio and thinking about how to prioritize resources for their efficiency portfolio and their spending on that. We can go on to the next slide. So this is an example of demand reductions from a residential demand response program. And so this is from the Pacific Northwest. This is from Portland General Electric. And they have this flex peak time rebate. It's a residential behavior-based DR program, and it's part of their residential flexible load portfolio. And they're using that to help achieve their decarbonization goals and also keep costs on the system low. And so they ran a pilot of this during 2021, and they found that, and there was a pretty extreme heat wave that occurred, and that's what this example is showing in 2021. And they found that the program delivered KW savings on a per enrollee basis about the same as it did when they ran it during non-extreme events. And so that was great news for them. You know, it's a resource that's available when they need it most. And then they also tried out, it's not shown on this slide, but they looked at doing the peak time rebate during winter morning hours, which is another time that the Pacific Northwest systems are peaking. And they got good results with that, with demand reduction that were comparable to demand reduction that they were seeing from winter afternoon events. And so seeing that it's a resource that's available throughout the seasons and at different points in the day as well. And then we can go on. I think this is my last slide. This is an example of DER aggregation and thinking about how to incorporate flexibility through a tariff. And this is from Arizona. The Arizona Corporation Commission required APS to file a tariff for distributed demand-side resource aggregation. And the tariff had to provide compensation for a lot of values: capacity, demand reduction, load shifting, locational value, voltage support, ancillary, and grid services. And APS put out an RFP to try and find resources that could, aggregators that could provide those resources. And they're shown how they were trying to recruit aggregators to respond to their RFP. Product A, B, and C, which was the product A is capacity, product B is locational, product C is ancillary services. APS ended up selecting an RFP, selecting a bidder that provided products across all of those services, but it ultimately didn't end up being a successful pilot, and they're going to have to try and they're going to redo their RFP and try this out again. But this is an example of a way to try and bring in other players besides utilities to promote demand flexibility. Yeah, and I think my next slide is just my contact info, and that wraps up my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. So next up is Karma Sawyer with the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Karma, you there?
I'm here.
Fantastic. The floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. My name is Karma Sawyer. I'm the Division Director for Electricity Infrastructure and Buildings at Pacific Northwest National Lab. So I'll be giving a follow-up presentation to what Natalie just presented, but talking to the flexible loads issue more from the perspective of a building technologies research program, but that is inclusive of things like electric vehicles, behind the meter storage, and things along those lines. We're really looking at this whole range of distributed energy resources and really trying to understand what the barriers are to seeing them being deployed in a larger way to be able to meet some of our goals around decarbonization, reliability, and resilience. Next slide, please. So before I go too much further, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the Building Technologies Office at the Department of Energy for the support for this research, both the work we're doing now and historically, specifically Brian Walker and Cecilia Johnson, as well as my colleague Srinivas Katapomala at PNNL, who's really been a thought leader in this research area for many decades and provided me with quite a bit of the content I'll be sharing today. Next slide, please. So flexible loads, the whole reason, right, that you invited Natalie and I here to speak is because there's a lot of opportunity to use this technological space to be able to provide supply and demand balance in a cost-effective manner. The reason for that is that buildings are really significant load. They account for about 75% of the country's annual electricity use and 80% of the peak load on the grid. And if you do some of the analysis, you'll see that we estimate that buildings can provide 77 gigawatts of power and 90 gigawatt hours of potential virtual storage. So when we're looking at some of these like large scale challenges, the building sector is a really big hitter just because of the number of buildings and the amount of electricity we utilize. But if you click again for a little animation, it's not quite that simple, because today's buildings are really not ready to be utilized in this way. About 85% of buildings today lack the proper control infrastructure to be able to be utilized for flexible loads. Even if they have building automation systems, they don't actually have the communication structures in place to be able to easily transact at scale. And there really aren't a lot of scalable solutions. More often than not, we're looking at really custom built solutions, which really limits the applicability at a larger scale. In addition to that, there are relatively few incentives in place for end users to really change the way they think about and utilize their loads because of the fixed price of electricity. Next slide, please. But all that being said, when you look just the commercial building sector, which is the place where PNNL has done the majority of the research, about half of the electricity in that sector in commercial buildings can be controlled because with the current infrastructure, however, it's only space, cooling, heating, and ventilation end uses that can actually be typically controlled. There are other DERs coming online soon. You might hear a lot about things like connected lighting, and then kind of these non-traditional building loads like battery energy storage or electric vehicles are coming online as well. Our analysis had shown that with that proper control infrastructure, if it were to be deployed, DERs have the potential to provide between 10 and 20% of demand flexibility for up to 2 to 4 hours without significantly impacting occupant comfort or service level. You could go beyond that. It just has impacts on that service level, and you need to be able to weigh the pros and cons of that type of approach. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off by talking in particular about small and medium commercial buildings. These buildings are defined as being below 50,000 square feet, and they generally do not have building automation systems. About 80% of commercial buildings fall into this small and medium commercial buildings category. Typically, these are served by RTUs or rooftop units for their heating, cooling, and ventilation loads. And managing, coordinating those RTU operations allow us to reduce the peak load without, again, impacting service level. And it's worth noting that serving these buildings with heat pumps with backup electric power that are not coordinated, that are just operating independently, has a significant risk of early morning peaks. But there are also plenty of opportunities in these buildings to bring on some of those newer DERs like connected lighting and electric vehicles that I referenced earlier. Next slide, please. So I wanted to introduce you to this concept of intelligent load control that PNNL has been researching for quite some time. This is an automated control method that is used to prioritize any controllable loads for the purpose of peak load management. You can think of this as like a business decision-making process, that prioritization process, where in our case, the goal is to manage the peak. Traditionally, if you have duty cycling controls, which have really been used for decades to manage peak loads of buildings, the way that that's done is it changes the ratio of the on period to the total cycle time in some way. ILC provides a more sophisticated way to make those decisions. So it uses both quantitative criteria, things like, what is the deviation from the set point, as well as qualitative criteria, like what's the type of zone and what room are we talking about here? Is it the corner office or is it a closet? And so that helps have kind of a few more knobs that you can turn in making decisions around these controls. Next slide, please. So we've done research in ILC in real building in a variety of different seasons. I'm going to show you just a couple of snapshots of what that research looks like. But the first thing I wanted to point out that in a large fraction of commercial buildings, both energy and demand charges are paid, obviously, on a regular basis, but the demand charge can be 20 to 50% of that total utility cost. But in most cases, it only occurs for a very small fraction of the month. We have done research to show that between 10 and 20% of this demand can be avoided without, again, impacting service levels using ILC. So what I'm showing you here are some of the tests that we did on heating seasons. So you can see that it's March 14th and 15th. So on the left graph, you see that we're not managing the peak at all. And on the right, we're doing it with ILC. So if you look at these graphics, the electricity demand is the blue line. That's the left y-axis. And the outdoor temperature is the purple line. That's the right y-axis. And this is from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. There's a red dot, that's the target demand in both, like, is a straight dotted line, target demand in both graphs. So because the buildings here use heat pumps with backup electric heating, you see that peak demand in that first day on March 14th is around 7 a.m. It gets up to 175 kilowatts, but the rest of the day never exceeds 145. And that duration is only 15 minutes. So we had a nearly identical day the following day on the 15th, and we ran ILC on this building, and we were able to keep the building peak to 150 kilowatts. And the peak for that demand still really never exceeded that target that was set at 7 a.m. So if you compare these two peaks, it's a reduction of about 20%. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see how that control actually impacted comfort within that building. So we're looking here again at March 15th, we're looking at heat pump 8 in that building. And you see the zone temperature in blue. Again, that's the left axis, and the zone set point is green. So that's that kind of like binary step function. These numbers are on the left axis. So the heating set point here for heat pump 8 is 72 degrees. That reduced down to 70 whenever ILC was managing the load. And so it did curtail, heat pump 8 was curtailed, but it simply released whenever that blue line got below the set point of 70 degrees. It turned the heating back on so it could maintain comfort level. You see the same thing if you go to the next slide for a summer example. I won't go through this in quite the same detail because the lines mean all the same thing. But in this case, we have a 15% peak reduction in July between the time we're not managing it on the left and we're using ILC on the right. And it is in the afternoon because it's the summer rather than the morning winter peak. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a very similar story for, in this case, heat pump 4, when the normal cooling set point is set to 70. And when ILC wants to control the unit, it increases that set point to 72 and turns the heat pump back on whenever the temperature exceeds the set point. So there are ways to go. We did this for 2 degrees. It's fairly conservative. You could easily go beyond that, and you would just have to manage your desire for peak load management relative to the comfort level in the buildings. So if you go on to the next slide, you'll see I'm going to pivot a bit now, going from the research that I just showed you in individual but real buildings to thinking about how to scale these in a better way. And this is the concept of connected communities that the Department of Energy has put quite a bit of funding out for in the last few years. Connected communities are defined as groups of grid interactive efficient buildings that have a wide range of different flexible distributed energy resources that can collectively manage for both efficiency and grid flexibility loads without impacting occupant comfort. The Department of Energy has funded a lot of projects in this space over the last few years. You see there's like a map there on the bottom of this slide. The blue ones are recent ones actually funded through a solicitation around connected communities, and the green dots are ones that kind of predate that. But LBL and DOE are collating all the results from these projects and sharing it broadly so that the information that is provided can be shared in a way that can help utilities make decisions around which different types of technologies and models might be useful in their particular circumstances. Most of these projects are still pretty early on, but I would encourage you to go to the Connected Communities website and explore a bit and get all the updates and things like that so you can see what's happening. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to quickly walk through two projects that are out on the West Coast to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. This is the first project in Spokane, Washington, that is targeting a virtual power plant created from building loads that are connected to feeder segments at the 3rd and Hatch substation in Spokane. So this is a project that includes 75 to 125 customers from residential through commercial and industrial loads that can tap into 1 to 2 megawatts of demand flexibility using a variety of different behind the meter DERs. It also includes energy efficiency measures that could result in up to 900 megawatts of savings. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to try to not make this too much of an eye chart since I can't quite point you with my arrow here. I'll do the best to describe where I want you to look. So you see at the top, that little blue square, that's the substation. And you see at the very bottom, there's this green square. Those are solution packages that are aligned with different building types. So you see there's a home and there are different types of commercial buildings. And there are these little colored dots at the bottom. Those line up with different packages of solutions. So the blue is an HVAC optimization package. So it's a combination of an efficient heat pump and a building automation system, for example. The black circle are energy efficiency upgrades. So that might be lighting upgrades and HVAC, efficient HVAC. And then the purple circles are DERs that are particularly ones that provide grid services. So you might think about EV charging stations and thermal energy storage, things along those lines. So for each different building type, we're combining different combinations of these packages to be able to see what can reliably be unlocked in each specific case. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see at a high level what the goals for this projects are. We want to actually be able to measure how much demand flexibility can provide, again, reliably, and see what the cost and benefit is to that 3rd and Hatch substation. We also want to demonstrate the communication platform that can optimize that dispatch of demand flexibility. That's a really big challenge, again, when we start thinking about scalability across different building types. And we also want to know what will motivate customers to participate in a program along those lines. So that involves working with our utility partners in Spokane and identifying the incentives that are effective and could be scaled to new programs. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the next example. This one is in Salt Lake City. It includes a suburban apartment complex, mixed-use retail, office buildings, microgrids, mass transit center. You get the idea, a ton of different building sites. But in this project, unlike what we're doing in Spokane, we're looking at buildings that are across the entire city. So it's not just tied to a single substation and could result in demand flexibility of up to 8 megawatts. There also is a goal to get 30 to 50% in energy consumption reduction through high performance building design. So this is more in the new construction space. If you go on to the next slide. So this project, which is called the UDERMS iCommunity, is again demonstrating that utility managed behind the meter DER program. And the specific objectives here are looking at integrating intermittent renewables, enhancing resilience and outage responses for the utility, ensuring resource adequacy, especially during disruptive events, and deferring some capital expenditures. And now I believe the next slide is my very last slide here, and then we can open it up for Q&A. If I want to leave you with a couple of important notes here, it really is that flexible loads are a very powerful tool and are incredibly broad in the way that they can be utilized to mitigate negative consequences from a high penetration of renewable generation while still having the same, if not greater, decarbonization opportunities. But the unfortunate reality today is that most buildings do not have the proper control infrastructure to actually make that happen. And some significant investment is needed in that space. We're looking for scalable market-based solutions that can be deployed, particularly in commercial buildings, that can provide cost savings both to building owners and operators as well as to utilities. And really keep an eye out for the Connected Communities project. I strongly recommend that you look it up. If you guys can send the information out to the participants about this program, I think there's going to be a lot of information, really useful information coming out in the next year or two that can help provide a playbook for cost-effective and scalable grid services from the building sector, and valuable data for commissions and utilities to be able to design programs that really will meet their particular needs. So that's all I've gone from now. Thank you all again for the opportunity.
All right, do we have any questions for Natalie and Karma? Yes, give us a second. We'll get you the microphone. Actually, if you want to go ahead and ask, I can try and repeat it until we get the mic on the floor. Okay, then maybe he needs a mic. Let's.
I'll just limit myself to one question. You said over 85% of buildings lack proper control infrastructure. I was wondering, as you talk about like DERs, and if we think about that as like rooftop solar, which can be on homes and businesses, and then even as you add batteries and electric vehicles, we're seeing the predictability of load change a lot, not just at the transmission level, but at the distribution level. How prepared are utilities to start implementing some of these programs? Do they have the needed infrastructure to start managing loads at the distribution level as opposed to the transmission level? And if not, how much work/money is needed to bring our utilities up to speed?
Natalie, you want me to jump in on that, or you want to go first?
I can. So integrated distribution system planning is a great way to start finding out what information the utilities have available and start gathering it and thinking about if the investments that they're making in their distribution system are reasonable or robust enough. And so I think that's an excellent place to start. A lot of places in the country, there's not very much transparency, maybe only to regulators, but to stakeholders in trying to understand where DERs can be implemented without distribution system planning, without requirements for distribution system planning. And I think that there's probably quite a bit of utilities that don't have this infrastructure in place, but I think there's a lot of examples of utilities that are moving in this direction, and virtual power plants and aggregators trying to get ready to be able to share this information with distribution utilities, to work collaboratively with them and to achieve, large quantities of flexibility or just load reduction from, buildings and things on the distribution side of the grid.
Yeah, I mean, I generally don't have a lot to add to that, but I do want to kind of foot stomp a little bit on that load reduction point, because I'm really passionate about the importance of flexible load management. We do have resources to be able to just do load reduction across the board in a relatively straightforward way, and is absolutely the most important first step to be able to have demand flexibility programs that are as effective as they could possibly be. And so I really encourage you not to think that this is the new thing without realizing they really go hand in hand, especially when you're thinking about it from a behind the meter perspective.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I have one. This is for both of you, but Natalie, you mentioned specifically like different ways that utilities were accounting for the capacity value of their EE resources, and also touched on some research that the lab had done on the time and locational value of EE resources. So I was curious, especially with MISO moving from their annual capacity valuation to the seasonal accredited capacity construct, like if you see opportunities for our utility EE programs to improve our accounting for the value of our EE resources, and if so, if you have any like tools or model programs that we could look at.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not super familiar with how MISO does their capacity credits for efficiency, if they do any at all. I'm more familiar with what PJM and ISO New England do because they let efficiency play in the market. So my understanding is that utilities tell MISO what's happening with their efficiency programs, and that's effectively what MISO puts into its plans regarding efficiency. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities to make the evaluation of existing efficiency programs much more robust. If you look through EM&V plans, not just in the Midwest, but all over the country, there isn't always even a demand reduction measurement that's being taken on the energy efficiency savings. And so there's this whole value stream that's not even being counted. And I think that's starting to shift. Like, people are recognizing that efficiency can reduce demand, but it's slow, you know? And so I think that having robust evaluation is a great place to start. I think trying to identify if your savings occurring seasonally, you know, just trying to understand what your grid needs are and what your current portfolio is doing is an excellent place to start. And that's usually with your EM&V through your utility program. So I'm happy to share some resources on that. I have several different links that I've written down that I can't put in the chat that I want to share. So I'm going to put them out via email. I have the Connected Communities one, and I have some research on valuing and measuring demand flexibility in utility programs and in buildings. I have another one that I wrote down that I already forgot. So
Natalie, if you want to provide that to us, we'll make sure to include it when we distribute the PowerPoints to everyone.
Excellent.
Carmen, did you want to address that?
No, I think Natalie did a great job.
Okay, fantastic. All right. If you all can join me in thanking Natalie and Karma for their time. That was fantastic information and definitely gives us some thing to shoot for in the future, a lot of things to develop. So thank you both very much for participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a great time.
It is. All right. So we're moving on to our next session here. And then after that session, we will have a break. But this next one